It has been a good while since I last covered BTD6, and the main reason why is just because, well, to be completely honest, as much as I still think this is a great game, I find it kind of difficult to play for a prolonged period of time, so I usually have these bursts where I get super into it, and then I get very, very bored. And one of the main things in the game that I think really helps prevent me from getting bored is user-generated content, like custom challenges and stuff like that. But all that is to say that I find this new update to the game very exciting, because I've been out of the loop, so I didn't even know this was coming, and so I was surprised to see that the main gimmick of this update wasn't a new Paragon or anything like that. No, the main gimmick of this update is that we finally have a map editor. I didn't even realize this was actually going to be added to the game, but I'm so glad to finally see this. I know that back in the day, a while ago, BTD4 technically had a map editor. I don't exactly remember how it worked, but I remember it was paid though, that you couldn't just use it for free. And so as a result, I actually never got to use it as a kid. Which means this is the first time I've ever been able to get my hands on some kind of map making tool for a Bloons game. So of course, I've kind of gone crazy. I've already made 8 whole maps using this map editor, and I obviously tried to put a decent amount of effort into them. Of course, already having made so many maps and putting a decent amount of time into making those maps, I obviously have some opinions on the editor already. And I've got to say it's interesting. So far, almost every aspect of the editor isn't middling. It either impresses me in how much you can do or disappoints me with how little you can do in certain areas. But I understand that to most of you, you're more interested in just seeing what maps I've been able to make. So how about I leave the map editor critique until the end, and for now I can just talk a little bit about the maps that I made so far. As you could probably guess, the gameplay in the background is of the very first map I made, Accursed Rainforest, which is why this is definitely the most janky. This was literally the first thing I did when I opened the level editor. I didn't even make a test level and then delete it and make a proper level. This was literally just the first thing I did, diving headfirst into the level editor, not even knowing what you could and couldn't do with it. And to be fair, to say that, I feel like it came out pretty good, and I think that's a testament to some of the better aspects of the level editor, that going in with no idea how it even worked, I was able to make this first try. But there were a few things about this that came out a little bit janky, because there were certain things I thought I would be able to do that I couldn't, that caught me off guard. Either way, as you can see, you can actually do some pretty good visuals with these custom levels. Even though there are obviously restrictions, you can get pretty creative with the tools you're given. And while the map has a bit of a janky look to it, just because of how much scaling and rotating I've done with so many different objects that were never meant to be scaled and rotated in those ways, at the same time, I think the way that it came out overall does visually look quite nice, just a little bit rough around the edges. And the gameplay itself works. I think the main problem here is that I was so desperate to just fill the entire canvas with everything I could that I kind of didn't leave that much space for towers, and that was partially intentional. I wanted this map to feel a bit claustrophobic, but after playing it a little bit more after I finished making it, I do think that I should have left at least a little bit more space for towers to be placed. One of the biggest things that I wasn't expecting to be able to do that I figured out I could do while making this level was to use one of the sub-menus known as stamps, which usually is one of the most useless menus, essentially just allowing you to put decorative 2D images on top of the track that you've already made as, well, just decoration, like grass effects or whatever, and most of these stamps really aren't that useful. However, there are a bunch of stamps dedicated to shading, and you can do a lot with these shading stamps, especially because they give you the ability to edit which layer the shading is on and whether it overlaps or goes under certain objects. This is what allows me to create this sort of black void in the back. You actually can't have a black void with the normal level editor. You always start with a template of full grass, full desert, whatever, you get the point. But you can kind of create this illusion that there's a black void there by stacking enough shading and shadows on top of those areas to the point where they just become pitch black. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is this became the gimmick of the very next level I made, and the one that definitely got the most plays. Though in fairness, it's a bit of a shame, because if anything, I think this was actually kind of the worst level I made. It was just kind of a gimmick level. But to be fair, I kind of knew that it would probably get a decent amount of eyes on it because it was a gimmick level, and because it was, I think, on the day that the update came out as well. That level being The Void. Essentially, just because I figured out the whole shading thing, I thought it'd be cool to make a level that looked like a black hole in space, and the black hole actually blocks line of sight. The actual ground would just be a whole bunch of floating objects you could place your towers on. There really isn't that much to say about this level, so while this might seem like I'm disregarding it a bit too quickly, as I say, there's just not much to say. It's mostly just what you see when you look at it. It's like, oh cool, it's a level that's a black hole. But to be honest, that's its main thing, it's just a gimmick. So those were the 2 levels I made on day 1 of the update. The next day, the next idea I had was to make a train station level, which ended up being this map. And yes, I'm aware this isn't perfectly symmetrical. Unfortunately, there aren't really good tools in the level editor to make things perfectly symmetrical, and there is an extremely high level of fine control, which is good and bad. Good because, you know, more control for you, but bad because if you want to perfectly copy what you did on one side on the other side as well, you're going to have some trouble. Especially because they don't really give you an easy way of being able to tell where the exact halfway point of the map is. And so yeah, trying to do these symmetrical maps is a bit difficult and you'll never get it quite right. But obviously, it's symmetrical enough. I'm trying to mess around here more with the gimmicks of how you can make objects so large they actually even go above the layer at which the balloons appear, and so you can hide the balloons under them, making it look like they're going into the train station and going across the tracks in the background, which are really just fences that have been rotated to look like train tracks. Even the walls of the train station are actually just crates that have been rotated to a weird angle to make them look sort of 2D when they're actually 3D. As you can see, this map has a decent amount of water, but they can only shoot in the gaps where there are no rocks. The rocks block line of sight otherwise. And there are a couple things also on this map which can block line of sight, such as the fountain, but if you stand on top of the crate, you can see over most of them. Now, you might think that it is really weird that if you stand on top of the crate, you still get your line of sight blocked by the tiny barrel below the crate, which seems like it shouldn't be able to block line of sight. That's unfortunately because some of the decorations in the level editor don't actually have collision, and so you can't actually have them as line of sight blockers by default. You can still use workarounds to make it so that they still block line of sight, which is what I did for this small barrel. However, if you use this workaround, then the game doesn't have any idea how tall the object is, and so it essentially is treated like it has infinite height. In other words, you can't look over anything that blocks line of sight if that thing doesn't usually have collision and you sort of manually add the collision back in. So unfortunately that does lead to some logical inconsistencies here, although that's the only major one here. After completing Train Station, I decided the very next thing I really wanted to do was to work on making a map that would be a sweet spot difficulty for me. You see, I think it's kind of a shame that for me personally, at least the level I play at, I feel like there's very few maps in BTD6 which hit the sweet spot for difficulty for me. I feel like most expert maps in the game become so difficult they're kind of annoying to deal with to the point of them not really being that fun to play anymore, other than for bragging rights. And I don't feel that way about the easier expert maps, but I also think, just by coincidence, the easier expert maps like Infernal and Dark Castle are just boring and unfun maps in their own right. Nothing to do with their difficulty, just they happen to not be very fun maps to play. And so this sort of sweet spot for me of either being extremely difficult advanced maps or pretty easy expert maps is something that I really crave. And so obviously a decent amount of these levels that I've wanted to make, I've decided that that's kind of my target difficulty, sort of on the line between advanced and expert, although I was more thinking easy expert than hard advanced. That brings me to this map, Island Hopper, which you might think at first looks like an advanced map for sure, or maybe even an intermediate if you're being especially cruel. Because in fairness, it's only 2 tracks, the tracks do overlap a little bit, even if not that much, and at least the land track is very, very long. The water track is a little bit short, but even then it's not particularly short. So it might look like this map is actually, if anything, maybe a bit easy, but I would still say it's got a decent amount of challenge to it. The main reason why is because you cannot, again, see over the rocks, which means that basically every single land island, quote-unquote, is kind of isolated. Any towers you place on there will barely be able to see anywhere that isn't on the island. Essentially, the thinking here is I wanted to make a map that was a 2-lane map that didn't have enough overlap for you to be able to easily just stack all your defense in one spot. However, it would make that a little bit less painful than it can be in a lot of expert maps where that becomes really unfun to deal with, by making it so that The water track is the shorter one, in which case you can use water-based towers like subs and boats to deal such enormous damage for such a good cost that it doesn't really hurt you too much, and you can make the water track sort of your main defense lane. And the land track is so long that you don't have to invest quite as much into defending it, so you can get away a little bit more with saving your money and not having to overinvest all too much into keeping the land track defended. And I think this level really hit the sweet spot. Overall, I found this one really fun to play, and I really enjoyed beating this one on chimps. That being said, after completing it, I realized that while this is still a difficult map and I still had a lot of fun beating it, it probably would get put under the advanced category, not the expert category. And so I decided I should take another crack at it. Well, I say that. Of course, there's always maps that don't belong in their difficulties. I would say this map is probably harder than Infernal and Dark Castle. But that being said, of course, most people don't even consider those real expert maps, and that they shouldn't count. And most people would consider a map like Geared, which is an advanced map, to be an expert map really that just is in the advanced category for some reason. So you could always make an argument this would count as expert, but I did think maybe I should turn up the difficulty a little bit more for the next one. Enter Autumn Acres. Now this map might seem like almost a step back in fairness, because this map does seem a little bit more bland than some of the other ones perhaps. Maybe at a glance at least. But I actually think this one came out real nice, because at the end of the day this one was more gameplay focused. I obviously still wanted it to look good, but I was less focused on being gimmicky or looking cool and more focused on just making this a good, sweet spot kind of difficulty map. The idea here was another take on trying to get this sweet spot where you have a multi-lane map, but not one that becomes obnoxious like most expert maps in how much money you have to waste in defending all three lanes. At the same time, of course, the lanes can't overlap too much to the point where you can just stack all your defense in one spot. And I think I achieved this. Because in fairness, while it is true that for the most part, most of the tracks will go to the left side around where that tree is, and that's a pretty long stretch of track, which is pretty easy to stack all your defense on, there is only one track that doesn't enter that area out of the three, the bottom track. Not only is this lane the only lane that doesn't touch the left side of the screen, but it's also the shortest of the three lanes. And this is kind of intentional. It's kind of on purpose that this lane is a decent amount tougher than the other two. Once again, this whole idea of you can't really easily defend this lane without putting your towers in spots where they can't defend the other two lanes consistently. However, the other two lanes aren't as much of a threat because they're longer and they do go into the area that's much easier to defend. Lastly, of course, this map, as usual, has a decent amount of line of sight pockets. I really like messing around with these things, and I really like levels that utilize them a lot. Now, was this one more difficult than Island Hopper? I would say by a small degree, yes. I actually had a pretty rough time beating this on chimps, honestly. It was a really easy start, actually, but from the start, things got really hard towards the end. And I thoroughly enjoyed beating this one on chimps, and it was the one that took the longest to beat on chimps. However, I also have to say the difficulty of this is pretty hard to measure. It probably would count as an expert map, but I have to admit, I was aware that this crate in the top left was going to be the best spot in the map, but I didn't quite realize just by how much it was going to be the best spot in the map. I realized that putting a sniper on here was probably going to be the main strategy I would use, and that ended up being the case. But it really does trivialize the early game. The sniper on this crate just does so much because it can basically see the whole map, which means you can kind of cover all three lanes, at least if you're using snipers to start with. And so you only really need to get defense on all three lanes for the period of the game where you don't have Bouncing Bullet with Alchemist yet, and you're also dealing with brute balloons that a sniper can't deal with otherwise. In fairness though, this does come back to bite you, and this is why this was actually the one that took me the longest to beat on chimps. Because towards the end of the game, this becomes really difficult again. Because while an elite sniper with faster firing and alch buff is enough to solo basically infinite amounts of fortified ceramics before round 80 hits, once you pass round 80 and super ceramics start coming, you don't have a good way to deal with super ceramics, and any tower that would be good to deal with super ceramics is going to struggle to cover all of the lanes. Not to mention, there aren't many options in the game at all, and certainly no particularly effective or consistent ones that are capable of slowing all balloons on the screen. Yes, you can have options that can slow all balloons within an area, or with something like Sabotage, maybe you can slow all balloons on the screen temporarily, but if we're talking a permanent everything on the screen goes slower, you don't really have anything to use in that case. And that's really important to use against all these super ceramics, which are ridiculously fast and ridiculously difficult to kill. So I could see this being a kind of map where maybe some people don't like it if they played it, because of the fact that the difficulty is so weird. A lot of the challenge in the early and the mid game is kind of gone because of how, well, just effective placing a sniper on that crate is. And it doesn't really come to bite you in the ass until you get towards the end of the challenge, when super ceramics start really busting in down the doors and making it way harder to defend yourself without actually putting serious ceramic defense on every lane and not just cheesing it with a sniper. That being said, once again, I kind of like this one. I thoroughly enjoyed beating this one on chimps. And I think that is mostly because I kind of find that the least fun part of chimps, getting past the early game and the mid game. The end game of chimps is what I'm there for, and the fact that this map kind of has all the challenge in the end game, but the early game and the mid game is actually quite easy, is actually kind of right up my alley. Moving on, of course, after making a difficult map like that, I decided to take a little break and make, honestly, a pretty normal map, if I'm being real with you, but one that I still wanted to try. You see, the BTD6 map editor gives you a lot of pre-made assets to work with, but of course that does kind of limit what you can do. And while most people have the ability to get creative with these things and really make something different, in fairness, the more creative you have to get to make the assets work for the theme you want, because you don't have assets that cleanly fit into that theme on their own, the more janky around the edges your level's going to look visually because of all the extra work you have to put in just to sell the theme that you're trying to create with objects that aren't meant for that theme. And because I've tried to do that a couple times already so far, I decided with this level, you know what, I haven't just sat down and tried to make a normal level yet with the actual theming that the actual props intended. As you could guess, while there is obviously a range that you have available to you when it comes to different kinds of objects and themes you can use, overall, the most popular theme by far is the forest/jungly kind of theme. There are just so many props in the game that fit into that theming that that's obviously the first thing that you should probably try. And so that's what I did with this. Honestly, it's kind of funny that this is one of the last things I ended up doing, but I finally just sat down and made a level that just looks nice with this sort of theming. This is a relatively easy map, although I reckon it would probably get put into intermediate. While the track is quite long and is only single track, if you look at it at a glance, it probably looks like a beginner map. There are a lot of line of sight blockers on this map, and once again, not a whole lot of space to put your towers. And so that means that overall, it is actually a little bit difficult to set up a defense that actually covers a good amount of the track, unless you can just focus enough DPS on one spot on the track that you don't need to spread your defense out. Once again, you can see over almost everything on the map if you use the crates on the left using a sniper or using any other tower that has infinite range. But again, this map isn't supposed to be difficult this time. This is kind of an easier intermediate map. I honestly don't have that much to say about this one, even though I'm still happy with how it came out. All I'll say is in this one, the rocks do not block your line of sight. I know that's a bit unfortunate that I kind of send mixed messages where sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Unfortunately, there just isn't a really good way to make it look natural when the water cuts off. Because in the map editor, if you don't put some objects between the water and the land, the water just kind of stops, and it kind of looks a bit wrong. And that's why every single time you see me use water, there's been rocks separating the water from the land. That's kind of the idea here, but I didn't want to actually, block off the line of sight of the water towers here, so here the rocks don't actually block line of sight, they're purely decorative. Really, the only gimmick there is to this level is that you can't place your towers on the leaves at the bottom right of the screen. That whole area is a no tower zone. The only spot that a tower is allowed in that area is that you can just barely fit a single tower inside the wheelbarrow, but that's it. I thought that was just a cute little gimmick to throw in there since the rest of the level was relatively bland, even if it is executed very well. Though I have to admit, of course, it's not really a big deal for the most part. It doesn't really change the way you play the map for the most part, because you just generally don't really put a tower there, except usually you're like free Dart Monkey just to catch some people that might leak. Getting close to the end, but our 7th out of 8th level was Warehouse, and I'm going to be relatively quick on this one. This one is probably another map that would probably be intermediate, and essentially my thinking here was that there were enough wooden objects that I could probably make an entire map look like it was like an indoor map, even though there wasn't like a wood or a stone backdrop. I could just completely cover the backdrop with objects and make it look like it was all like inside a warehouse or whatever. In reality, I feel like it didn't really work out like I was pitching it in my head. I still obviously put this level out there because I still think, well, I did it. I wanted to make a warehouse level and I made a warehouse level. It still has some level of uniqueness to it. But I do have to say, in fairness, I think, honestly, this is like the second worst after the Void one of the levels that I put out. And it's a good example of what I mean by you can make these more creative levels where you're making a theme that doesn't technically exist by using the props that you have at your disposal more creatively and using them for things they're not intended for. But if you do it, you end up making the visuals jankier and harder to make look nice. Believe it or not, I probably spent longer on this map than any other map that you've seen in this video, and yeah, it probably didn't turn out better for it. I had to spend so long aligning all of these wooden planks so they did just perfectly stand next to each other without any overlap or anything like that, or any clipping or glitching or whatever. Every single plank you see on the screen, for the most part, had to be manually placed perfectly without any kind of overlap. And that was extremely tedious. Thankfully, I had some videos to watch in the background while I was doing it. But after all that work, it doesn't even really look that good. It achieves looking different. It just doesn't really achieve looking great, which is unfortunate. Yeah, bit of a shame, honestly. But I still thought it was worth uploading. As I said, I put a while into it, and it is still a unique look, just not necessarily the best look, I feel. However, that brings us to Watery Grave. This one is, once again, another attempt at making an expert map, and I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out. And I also feel like this one, so far, is the most difficult map I've made. I think that Island Hopper, Automakers, and this map are all pretty similar in difficulty, but I think this one's the hardest. And that's mostly because, unlike with the other two maps, this multi-lane map is once again a 3-lane map, but there really isn't any spot where the 3 lanes become easy to all defend. The best spot you get is the bottom middle, where technically you can see all 3 tracks. However, for one of the tracks, you can only see the very, very end, and for the other 2, you can only see the start, which obviously poses a bit of a problem. Once again, the visuals do get a little bit janky for this map, especially when you try and place towers on these higher up rocks. Behavior with decorations when it comes to putting them on higher elevations is very weird and very buggy currently, and so it's very awkward and difficult trying to get decorations to appear correctly on the platforms and not interfere with the towers you try and place on those platforms. So this is kind of the best I could get. Either way, you can see that I'm kind of taking advantage of the whole gimmick of blocking the sight of the balloons by using objects that are so tall they actually go over the balloons, by having the balloons seeming to go through these rocks like a sort of tunnel through the rocks, by the rocks just being so huge they actually cover the balloons as they go inside the portal thing. Once again, quite a few things that can block line of sight here, but if you get a sniper on top of one of these 2 rocks, then they can see everything except they can't see past the tree. That is the one thing that blocks them no matter where they are. As you can also see, there's not a lot of land to work with. Most of it is just on the tops of the rocks themselves, although there is that very critical spot at the top left, which is an amazing spot for a land tower, be it a dart monkey or a tack shooter or whatever. Although unfortunately, of course, it will only cover the 1 lane. I like the way that this one came out because I feel like with this map, even though there are no spots, at least no good spots where you can cover all 3 tracks, there are lots of spots where you can pretty well cover 2 of the tracks. I feel like the main reason a lot of these expert maps which just have loads of tracks you can't possibly cover all at once can feel really obnoxious. It's just because it feels like it just exists to say, fuck you, you never get to set up. Have fun not being able to use the village or whatever, or not being able to use alchemists properly. But by making it so that it's really, for the most part, only ever one of the 3 lanes you're not able to defend whenever you start setting up a bit of defense, it means that as long as you can cover the weaknesses that these 1 lanes are missing, you can kind of still compensate for it all. And it also creates a bit of an interesting juggling act where you have to kind of remember, okay, what defenses do I have left on each of these 3 lanes? What are they all lacking? For instance, and I genuinely don't remember as I'm recording this whether I got a submerged sub at the bottom middle or not, but if you do cover technically all 3 lanes with the D camo. But of course, as I mentioned before, one of the lanes you're only covering the exit, not the entrance. And so that means for that third lane, you're going to have to remember that you don't have good camo detection for that lane and come up with your own camo defenses specifically for that lane. However, it's not like your decamo has been worthless. You covered 2 out of the 3 lanes, and technically it still covers the third lane, just only so late that it doesn't matter that much. I will say though, one of the only things about this map that is a little bit unfortunate is, as you can imagine, starting the first round on this map is a bit of a nightmare. If you need me to explain, it's because, well, chimps mode, 1 life, no knowledge, all you can do is like triple dart, a dart and a sub, or a sniper and a dart, basically. Those are your options. And when you look at this and realize there's 3 lanes, not many good spots for dart monkeys, so that kind of ruins the 3 dart strategy, and you kind of realize, hang on a minute, wait, if you're placing a sub and a dart or a sniper and a dart, that means there's going to be lanes that aren't covered. You'll realize why this is awkward. Now, fortunately, as you can guess, obviously, I beat the level on chimps, it is possible to beat the first round on chimps. It's just, unfortunately, it was one of those things where you need a very specific placement. So hey, if any of you watching wants to give this map a try on chimps, then I'll let you know how you beat the first round, because honestly, trying to figure it out on your own would probably be a little bit obnoxious unless you found it relatively quickly. That being that if you put a dart monkey on the left side of the little sort of wooden planks on the right side of the screen, and then also put a submarine that you place as high up as possible in the bottom middle little section where all 3 of the tracks converge, then you will actually be able to beat the round, because although you will leak a couple balloons to the top exit, the homing darts from the sub from previous shots will steer themselves into the balloons. Now, usually placing the submarine a little bit further down or a little bit further to the left would be more ideal to get more general coverage of all 3 lanes, and more balanced coverage. But unfortunately, if you do that, then the darts don't steer themselves correctly and the first round can't be beaten. Thankfully, I stumbled into this strategy relatively quickly, but I did briefly try and experiment and see if there were other ways to beat the first round, and that is the only way I found that works. So I'm not sure, but it might be literally the only possible way you can beat the first round, is to know that if you place the sub in that exact spot, then the homing darts will catch the balloons as they go for the top exit, and you'll be able to beat the first round. The round after the first round actually ends up being easier than the first round, and then from there you can afford a sniper, which with its full map range will be able to deal with the next coming rounds pretty easily. The only thing you're worried about is round 10, but by then you'll be able to afford twin guns, and I'll leave the rest for you to figure out, but from there, things are pretty easy until the early mid-game. I guess that'll just leave a couple little extra fun facts I can throw in about this map. For one, I genuinely don't know if I'm dumb and I can't find it anymore, or if I actually somehow did something that broke the level. That little bottom middle spot, you're supposed to be able to put a land tower on it. You could definitely do it. I did it before. You just had to be like something small, like a dart monkey. But for some reason, when I went to actually beat the level to prove it was beatable, I couldn't do it anymore, even though I literally just did it before and I hadn't changed the collision at all, or the decoration or anything. I hadn't touched that area. But all of a sudden, I just couldn't place a tower there. I don't know if I just got lucky the first time and actually the spot is super precise and I just couldn't find the spot again, or if somehow you actually can't place a tower there anymore, but if you can't, you're supposed to be able to. Whoops. Either way, it's not necessarily a super big deal since it was supposed to be a relatively small spot anyway. Second, if you couldn't tell, the little ladder here is actually a rotated fence. Just once again, trying to find creative reuses for these objects, using them for things they weren't originally intended for. Third, you'll see in this map, they actually have this thing where the rocks block line of sight like the previous maps, but they actually don't block line of sight when you're on the high up platforms on the rocks. And considering these decorative rocks don't usually have collision, you might be confused how that's possible, because I mentioned before, if you have to add the collision in manually using a workaround, then that should mean that it doesn't matter how high up you are, the line of sight still gets blocked. But of course, I wanted it to be so that you actually could look over the rocks if you were on top of these higher rocks, just because it visually makes sense for that to be the case. And the way that I managed to do that, actually, was to take some other larger rock objects which do block your line of sight and rotate them to such a point that you actually can't even see them anymore, flipping them upside down and making them basically invisible. But they still exist there and they still block line of sight. Then it was just a question of rotating them and scaling them and moving them around enough until they generally fit the rock patterns of the decorative rocks. And then I managed to get these things to block line of sight without blocking line of sight if you're from a higher up point that can look over them. I might end up using this sort of workaround a lot more often in future because I really like having these maps where there's a lot of line of sight blocking, but then there's a little bit of prime real estate on the map where you can look over all the line of sight blockers. Alright, if you were here just for the gameplay, I suppose this is where you can stop watching, but it is where I give my thoughts and critique on the level editor itself. As I say, I'm obviously really happy it even exists in the first place, but I obviously think that, I mentioned earlier, it both impresses and disappoints me at the same time in different aspects. So, I guess let's start with what impresses me. For one, it's mostly the decoration. You've got quite a lot of options of pre-made assets from already existing maps to drag and drop in, and while that alone would be, you know, quite a lot to mess around with, on top of that, there's something very important which I feel lets you get a lot more use out of these things. That being, when you drag an object in, you actually have a lot of control of how it is displayed. It's not just you drag it in and there it is. You got its rotation, you got its scaling, you got even like leaning forward and backwards and left and right. And that means that, obviously, while you can get some very janky and weird looking things, which you have to kind of control for, you also can get some really creative things working. Like, for example, I literally just had this idea on the spot, but you could sort of use this slider to put this down like that. Maybe you might be able to make a sort of weird half-wheel sort of thing, like make this, if you put this like... Oh, it is a shame that actually it does come from there. I was thinking if you could hide these two planks, so maybe if like I got a different object, let's see, where's the... Yes, this object to cover it. You can have like a weird sort of wheel thing. You see, you can get kind of creative with how you use these objects, thanks to the fact that you have these really, really cool controls on being able to rotate them in whichever way you want. So that's very, very good. And you do have a lot available to you. And while it is a bit of a nightmare to navigate this, they do help a little bit by providing all these categories. So yeah, that's definitely good. That's definitely one of the upsides. The other upside is the areas system, where you can sort of drag and drop in areas you can define. That's really, really nice, especially because they have the blocking area, which doesn't allow towers or shots to go through it, and you have the no towers area, which is just what it sounds like. This one doesn't block shots though. And I gotta say as well, these this blocking area has been really, really useful. With some of my levels. I mentioned that's the workaround I use to make objects that otherwise don't have collision block line of sight, is using that area. Although, as I mentioned, it does have the restriction of not having a height value, so you can't look over areas like this using, you know, crates or whatever, because of the fact that they extend upwards infinitely. But yeah, overall, these things are features I wouldn't even have expected on the level editor on launch, so these are great. Now, I think... Oh, one more thing before we get into the bad. The paths. You get to do a lot more with the paths than I thought you might have. For one, I was expecting it to be a grid-based system, and clearly it isn't. You actually have quite a lot of control over how the path can look. You can make it very weird and bendy if you want. You can definitely get some very strange-looking paths if you really wanted to. But yeah, you can mess around with this quite a lot. Make something like that. And you can even edit the... Oh, just now, let me make a more sensible path and then just... I don't know. You can even edit the width of the path if you want to, like that. And obviously you have a few path options to choose from. So yes. There you go. But I think this is where we have to start getting into the negatives. And since we're already on the paths menu, how about we start with the paths? So while it is good that you can have more than one path, here's a problem that I have. Because you have so much control over these paths, it almost gets to the point where you kind of have too much. Now don't get me wrong, I definitely think it's better that we have all this control than us not having this control, but I also think that there are some situations where I just want a straight line or a nice curve, and it's just so difficult to get the curves to look identical. it kind of looks off if the lines aren't straight or the curves aren't identical to each other. But as you can imagine, because you get such a ridiculously fine level of control, it becomes ridiculously difficult to try and, well, maintain those curves looking nice and smooth and not a bit janky and bumpy or whatever. It gets quite annoying trying to do that. Right now we're just doing basic paths, so it's not too hard. But as you can imagine, in more complicated maps where you have less space to work with, it gets really difficult trying to make it look smooth. So I get why. I definitely think it's better that we don't have a grid-based system and we have this. But I would kind of like if there was some sort of snap to grid feature that you could toggle on or off. Like you could just simply have straight lines guaranteed, or curves that are basically perfect guaranteed, that are just these like almost like the corner of a rounded square sort of curves. I would like it if that was something like where you could turn it on and off between simply just adding straight lines and like perfect curves, and then switch it back to, okay, now we have the janky, like, draw it however you want freehand thing again. That would be nice. But this one's a bit of a nitpick, honestly. Now to get to some of my bigger problems. And my first one might sound a little bit weird, like a bit one that might not really be a big issue, but I think it's a lot bigger of an issue than it sounds. We have quite a lot at our disposal here, and yet a lot of it is not very helpful for one theme in particular, which covers a wide variety of different kinds of levels. Those being simply indoor levels. Whether it be wooden, sort of urban indoor levels, whether it be metal, whether it be stone, whatever it is, there are basically no tools here for making an indoor level, which I think is really disappointing. I kind of get why there isn't like a futuristic one, because, you know, you don't see many BTD6 maps like that, or like a metal one, but why there isn't just like a, you know, just like a wood floor? Like, these are all of your options. You've got grass, more grass, leaves, desert, sand, ocean, and more ocean. These are not very good options, to be honest. Like, no snow, no... Well, I guess this is kinda can be used as jungle, but no jungle-like background. No, ruins is the big one. I know this might sound weirdly specific, but I think sort of ruins sort of aesthetic would work great for the level editor. Because it's ruined, you can get away with it looking a little bit janky and not perfectly put together, because, you know, it's supposed to be like old ruins. It fits in with the jungle aesthetic of BTD6 generally, and then on top of that, it would explain a lot of the blocky level design you tend to get in a lot of user-made maps. So I think ruins sort of theme would fit perfectly here, and I'm sure there's plenty of assets already in the game that can fit perfectly with that. God knows there's a decent amount of maps with that sort of ruins aesthetic to them, things like Chutes and Sanctuary. I think that's the name of the expert map I'm thinking of. But no, you don't get a single asset that fits with the ruins theme. I mean, you might get some rock assets, and there is a category for them, but when you look at the rock assets, they're all like sea rocks. They're all like rocks you'd see in the ocean. None of these rocks really look like, except the mesa rocks, I guess, none of these look like the kind of rocks that would fit in a ruins theme. So, yeah, these aren't exactly ideal. And I really feel that's a missed opportunity. I think there's a lot of themes here that aren't covered even in the slightest, and while I understand why some of them aren't covered, definitely some of the more out there or specific ones, some of the more basic ones, again, like snow, there's a good amount of snow maps in the game. Don't tell me that there isn't enough snow-based assets in the game to, like, put in. There definitely is. So, there's that. Okay, now getting on to actual functionality complaints besides just visuals, because I think overall they do a good job with the visuals. I think the biggest thing that I have to complain about is something that sounds very simple. If I go to, let's see, platform, these are objects that you can place things on top of. Oh, wait, well, this is another example of another thing I complain about. This wasn't even what I was going to bring up. There is other objects that are platforms that don't show up here for some reason, and I can tell you that because... Wait, it's still not showing up? I know this item is in here. This rock right here. This rock is both a platform and a blocking object, and I believe it's also the only item in the entire editor which is both of those things at once, which is a little bit weird, and also restricts your options quite heavily, but hey, that's what it's like. Either way, you can see that this has a tick box. You can turn on or off the fact that it blocks projectiles to disable its collision. Now, this is a good feature, but why am I bringing it up? I'm bringing it up. You can do the same for animation as well if it's an object that animates. I'm bringing all that up because I cannot believe they don't have any way in this editor to make objects payable removables. What I'm saying is, hey, let's say, let's go back to the blocking category, down here. Also, the scroll wheel moves that very slowly, which is a bit annoying. And let's say we put a big log in the way of these two paths. And it's blocking line of sight, and oh boy, it's difficult to work with. I don't see why there can't just be a tick box here below the blocking tick box that says pay to remove. And when you tick it, you get a little slider, and you choose how much money it costs to pay to remove this. Why is that not a feature? And I know it might seem a little bit like I'm being a bit harsh here. I understand that it sounds like they're planning to add more to this level editor, which I really hope they are, because there's so much potential for this map editor. But I'm kind of amazed this wasn't here from the beginning, considering I doubt it would be very difficult for them to do, and it would be absolutely critical for the creation of creative levels. I mean, this was like a base feature of BTD6. This was like the big new gimmick when BTD6 first came out, was having these things that block line of sight that you could also pay to remove. We hadn't seen that before BTD6. So it feels weird to finally get the BTD6 map editor, and one of the flagship sort of very first brand new features BTD6 brought to the table isn't available in the map editor. I understand why more complicated things, like obviously stuff like the conveyor belt on, Workshop and the devices on that map, I get why things like that aren't in the level editor. They obviously would require a lot more effort to implement. But something like just, oh, here's a thing that already works, that you can already put in the level editor that just blocks a line of sight, like, I imagine it shouldn't be too hard to just make it so you can click on it, get a pop-up, say, pay this much to remove, yes, and it pops out of existence. I can only guess maybe they haven't done it, because in normal maps, a specific animation plays for removing just about every object. And, sometimes a helicopter comes in and picks it up, sometimes it gets blown up, or whatever. And don't get me wrong, I would understand that if it weren't for the fact that, let's be real, they could just make it pop out of existence. It could just go, and I don't think anyone would complain. I think everyone would be happy with that. So, yeah, this might seem like something where maybe I'm overblowing it, but there are so many ideas I've had for BTD6 maps that I can't do because this feature isn't in there. There's even ideas I had for maps that are more ambitious, which I couldn't literally do exactly what I have in mind in the map editor, but I could at least approximate it quite closely if I had the ability to use payable removables. And yet I can't do it at all now because of everything I've just said. So, anyway. The other thing which I'm kind of disappointed about is while overall the path system works pretty well, I've got to say, I'm surprised that portals aren't implemented. And by portals, I mean situations, you've seen it in many maps where the path leads somewhere and then it goes off screen or behind an object or into a tunnel or whatever, and the balloons disappear and pop out the other side somewhere else. They don't leave the screen and make you lose lives, they just appear in a different spot. That is a feature in so many maps in this game, and I feel like it probably shouldn't be too hard to implement. And yeah, it's not here. And that feels really, really sad because, well, it would be really, really useful. You can still sort of approximate it by, as I said, blocking line of sight to the balloons using huge objects to make it look like they disappear and then reappear out the other side. But not only is this a really janky way of doing it that requires a lot of extra effort and severely limits how you can use this option, but on top of that, it also isn't exactly the same because since the balloons don't actually teleport, they just become invisible for a bit. It means that it actually is going to take a certain amount of time for the balloons to disappear from one spot and then reappear from the other, which might not be what you want to happen. So yeah, now I brought both of these up, I want to hit you with an example so this isn't as abstract. I had an idea a while ago for a BTD map, and I wanted the theming of it to be sort of ruins-like, or a mine, one or the other. And of course I can't do either of those themes really with what I have here. I'm obviously just going to make a very, very rough approximation of it. But the idea of the map essentially was a map where you had a path that would start up here at the top and come out just that side. In a straight line, it would have a bunch of stuff blocking placing towers, so there's only a little bit of room to place towers at this first track. But this wouldn't be the exit. Once it disappeared down there, this whole first third would be part of a tunnel, and that whole first sort of top third of the screen would be part of an extremely high up cliff and all that. And then below that, there's a lower ground where the balloons then pop out a tunnel here, and come down like this. And then go into another tunnel up here before going off the left side. And in this big open space here, there would be a big platform you could place all your towers on. But this platform would be lower down than this path, so you couldn't see onto this path. And then finally, the balloons come back. Oh, the balloons would come back out here, and then go towards here, and then the exit would be here at the bottom. And there would be another gap here where there's a sort of cliff face. And the main gimmick of the map was going to be this central area where most of your towers go, would be on a platform that could be raised or lowered. And so you could pay to raise the platform up so that it could see both the top area and the bottom area, and that would be valuable since, as I mentioned, the top area, there was going to be a whole bunch of stuff blocking your ability to place things. So, obviously I can't do this right now with the actual map editor, because I can't create a platform that gets risen when you pay a certain amount. And don't get me wrong, I couldn't do exactly that even if they did add payable removables. But I'm sure you can understand how, if they did add payable removables, I could at least make a pretty close approximation of this map just by adding a line of sight blocker across this big stretch here that you can pay to remove, and then once you remove it, it would effectively be like that platform had moved up and you could now shoot up here. So yeah, that's an example of the kind of map ideas I have that I can't do because this requires both portals to be in there and it requires payable removables. And there's plenty of other ideas I've had kicking around which just aren't possible with what I have right now, and it's a big shame. Other than that, the stamp system kind of sucks. The shading is really nice, and I have to admit the layering system is very robust. But stamps as a whole kind of suck, and I have no idea why you can't rotate or scale these, and instead you just have to use the randomize button and hope you get what you want. That's kind of stupid. And I guess lastly, areas. If you want to make a very small area, it gets extremely difficult not making it without it looking extremely stupid. Like if I just want to make a small circle and I want it to look perfect, it gets really awkward. Like, that looks wrong. And there's definitely been a lot of trouble I've had whenever I need to just create a small area that's just a tiny area, just a small little ring of grass around something or whatever. This becomes a nightmare, and I hate having to do this. So yeah, those are my negatives on the level editor, but overall, if they actually are going to keep adding more features to this map editor, this is huge for the game, and this is probably going to be the biggest source of replayability for BTD6 in the long term, in my opinion. The big thing though, the huge thing that I want to see, although I understand why this wasn't here on launch, because this one I understand is a bit of a bigger undertaking, but my god, combining user-made challenges with user-made maps. As of right now, you can't do that. But if you can make your own user-made challenges on user-made maps, that would get crazy. And it would allow for the creation of things like challenge maps, where you can create challenges with extremely unique gimmicks and kind of objectives based on map layouts that don't exist in normal official levels. That would be amazing to see. With all that said, that's what I think of the new level editor in BTD6. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.